The sharp whine of a saw cut through the dusty silence of the workshop. Jamal Rivers, his ebony skin slick with sweat, leaned into the oak board with steady hands. Then snap. The plank kicked back, and pain tore through his arm like lightning. He staggered, the saw still humming, and the world tilted. He looked down, his right arm bent wrong, wrapped in sudden agony. By the time the dust settled, Jamal sat on a stool, sweat dripping, his dream of opening riverlight crumbling in the haze. He thought he'd face this storm alone. But then the door opened, and in walked a woman he never expected, Vanessa Cole, in a red dress that caught the dim light like fire. She wasn't just another nurse. She was defiance, confidence, and trouble wrapped together. And from that moment, nothing about Jamal's broken life would ever be the same. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment about what touched you most. Wishing you a wonderful day filled with hope and strength. The morning light over Riverside, Tennessee looked tired, as though the sky itself had worked late the night before. Clouds, swollen with leftover rain, sagged across the horizon and pressed a muted silver against the rooftops. The two-lane road that cut past Maple Street shimmered with puddles where early traffic sent ripples moving like fish through shallow water. Riverside was not a city that liked attention. It was the kind of town where people nodded from porches instead of waving, where the church bell served as both clock and conscience, and where a man's name was measured by how steady he showed up at work. Down Maple Street stood a low cinder-block building with a corrugated roof and a wooden sign that swung with each gust of wind. Rivers and Sons Woodworks. The shop smelled of sawdust, varnish, coffee gone stale, and ambition. Inside, Jamal Rivers moved like a man wrestling with impatience. He was 25, tall enough that he stooped a little under the fluorescent lights, his chest and shoulders broad from years of lifting planks thicker than his legs. His skin was a deep brown, smooth but marked at the forearms by pale scars where chisels and splinters had kissed too hard. Jamal's face was angular, softened only by a trimmed beard that outlined a mouth more often set in determination than in laughter. His eyes were hazel, quick to darken when he brooded, and brooding had become a habit since his dream of opening his own shop began to feel both close enough to touch and far enough to crush him. He wore a gray cap, jeans spotted with glue, and boots that carried the exhaustion of too many late nights sweeping sawdust. Jamal's greatest pride was not his physique or his hands, but what his hands represented. He could turn a raw plank into a table that felt like a family heirloom. He could make strangers see possibility in a piece of oak. Yet those same hands betrayed him with nervous tremors when he thought too long about money, bank loans, or the skeptical grin of Mason Hale, the older woodworker who ruled Oak Ridge Road with prices just low enough and rumors just sharp enough to make Jamal's savings seem like pennies against a vault. At the break table sat Raymond Rivers, 59, Jamal's father. Raymond was built like a pier pylon, straight, broad, his body scarred by decades on ships. His hair was a weathered silver gray, clipped short, his jaw square, and his pale blue eyes carved deep from squinting at horizons most men never saw. He carried himself with the calm authority of someone who had faced down storms and still believed discipline was the only way to survive. Raymond was a Navy veteran, later a merchant sailor, and finally, when the sea gave him more aches than wages, he settled into woodworking. But his loyalty to duty never left him. Love to Raymond was expressed in the way he demanded his son sweep straighter, cut cleaner, and show up on time even if blood was in his socks. Their companionship was punctuated by Ginger, the shop cat. A gray and white tabby with a crooked tail, Ginger had made the woodshop her home years earlier. She lounged on stacks of offcuts and inspected customers with the dignity of a landlord. Jamal always insisted he didn't care for cats, yet he spoke to Ginger as if she were his silent confidant, often calling her queen when he passed by. Ginger, like any queen worth her crown, tolerated the affection only when she pleased. On the bench rested a plank of ash wood, long and pale, with grain that shimmered faintly under the light. Jamal had milled it last week for a commission, a custom entry table for the high school principal who wanted furniture that felt like a handshake. Jamal loved that description. It was the reason he'd worked late sketching designs and sanding edges until his eyes stung. That morning, he intended to cut a waterfall miter so the grain would flow unbroken from top to side like a river turning a corner. He measured carefully, adjusted the fence on the table saw, and pushed forward. His father sat at the table reading the newspaper, grumbling at the headlines. Ginger flicked her tail. The saw whined, biting into the ash. Jamal leaned in. He thought about his notebook where he had drawn the Riverlight logo, a stylized R shaped like a current, a name he whispered to himself when sweeping alone at night. He thought about the woman at the bank who smiled politely while telling him his loan application was unrealistic. He thought about Mason Hale, who probably laughed at the idea of Riverlight surviving even a year. Then the sound changed. A hiccup in the blade's whine. The grain pinched, the board bucked, and in a blink the wood kicked sideways. Jamal reached instinctively to steady it. His right forearm slammed against the iron table with a sickening crack. He staggered back, the world whiting out in a flash of pain so sharp it tasted like iron in his mouth. Raymond was on his feet instantly. His calm, sailor's eyes swept the scene, the toppled-out feed stand, the plank on the floor, his son's face pale with shock. He crouched beside him. "Break or bruise?" "Break," Jamal whispered, clutching his arm. Raymond cut the saw and thumbed the emergency stop. He wrapped the limb in a towel from the first aid kit, his hands steady despite the storm in his chest. "You'll live," he said, his tone flat, though it meant I'm terrified but holding it together. He half-carried his son to the truck. Ginger yowled from her perch as if scolding them both. The drive to Riverside Urgent Care was a blur of wipers and rain-smeared glass. Jamal pressed his head against the window, sweat cooling on his brow. Pride burned sharper than the pain. At the clinic, Nurse Darlene Poole met them. She was mid-40s, compact, hair braided tight into a bun. Her eucalyptus green scrub smelled faintly of antiseptic. She had the practiced briskness of someone who had seen worse and could talk sense into a panicked linebacker. "All right, gentlemen, who angered the saw gods?" she asked while strapping a cuff around Jamal's arm. "Table bit back," Jamal groaned. Darlene led them to X-ray. The film showed a fracture in the radius and a hairline crack in the ulna. Dr. Peter Lang, a young physician in neon-laced sneakers, rolled in on a stool. He had kind eyes behind square glasses and the enthusiasm of someone still surprised by his own authority. "Good news, no displacement. Bad news, you're benched for 6 to 8 weeks. He tapped the film with a capped marker. "You're a woodworker?" "Trying to be a shop owner," Jamal said, hating the word trying. "Then treat this like a violinist treats a finger. Set it right, protect it, no shortcuts." He smiled as if to soften the blow. The cast went on, fiberglass blue, wrapped snug around Jamal's forearm. Darlene adjusted a sling and murmured, "This is temporary. Don't let it convince you otherwise." Her voice carried both warning and kindness. Back in the waiting room, rain hammered the glass. Raymond filled out insurance forms with a sailor's suspicion. Jamal stared at his swollen fingers, anger simmering beneath the pain. The drive home was silent but heavy. Raymond's hands gripped the wheel at 10 and 2. Finally, he said, "You'll be off the floor for 6 weeks. Maybe 8. That's 2 jobs delayed. We'll manage." His voice was calm but sharp. "This is why I tell you dreams of your own shop are fantasy. One slip and it's gone. You want debt and responsibility when one machine eats your arm? Stay here, learn the books, and maybe one day we talk partnership. Until then, don't gamble." The words landed like wet canvas on Jamal's chest. He wanted to shout that Riverlight wasn't fantasy, it was survival for his soul. But his arm throbbed, his throat thickened, and all he said was, "I'm not quitting." "I can't." You taught me that. Raymond looked at him a long moment, his eyes softening, though his jaw stayed stern. "Heal first. Then we talk." That evening, rain eased into mist. Jamal sat at the workbench, notebook open. He scrawled with his left hand. Goal remains the same. Open Riverlight by summer. Adjust approach. Build patience. He pressed the pencil harder than he should, but the stubborn line felt good. When Raymond came to lock up, he set something on the table, a pocket knife with a smooth bone handle. Your grandfather's. He whittled rope ends when the sea was boring. Keep your fingers away from the blade. It was the closest to an apology Jamal had ever known. They left together under the dripping sky. Ginger watched from the window, tail curling like punctuation. The morning after the accident carried the stale dampness of yesterday's storm. Riverside's sky had cleared to a pale, washed-out blue, but the streets still gleamed dark with puddles, and the scent of wet asphalt clung in the air like a stubborn perfume. Inside the Rivers household, the kitchen clock ticked too loud, every minute stretching longer than it should. Jamal Rivers sat at the table with his right arm trapped in its plaster prison, a sling wrapping across his shoulder. He looked restless, like a runner forced to sit in the bleachers. His hazel eyes, which usually brightened at the prospect of work, now tracked the window pane as if escape lay just beyond the glass. Raymond Rivers, his father, leaned against the counter with his arms folded. In daylight, Raymond's weathered features seemed even sterner. His jaw carried the stubborn line of a man who had survived storms both at sea and at home. Raymond had already made calls that morning to the insurance, to 2 clients, and finally to a number written on a card he kept tucked in his wallet. That call was the one Jamal noticed most. "I don't need a nurse," Jamal muttered. His voice cracked between pride and irritation. "You need someone to keep you in line while I'm at the shop," Raymond replied flatly. "You heal right, or you'll regret it for the rest of your life." "Don't argue." Jamal shook his head, but the weight of fatigue kept him from pushing further. The doorbell rang around noon, sharp and unexpected. Ginger the cat bolted from the living room, her tail puffed like a plume. Raymond moved to the door, muttering under his breath about schedules while Jamal craned his neck toward the hall. The door opened and the house seemed to inhale. Vanessa Cole stepped inside. She was 27, striking in a way that turned every head without effort. She wore a fitted red dress that clung just enough to demand notice, the shade bright against her smooth brown skin. Her hair, deep black with waves tumbling to her shoulders, framed a face with high cheekbones and a sharp jaw softened by full lips painted a subtle rose. Her eyes, emerald green that seemed almost unreal, held a spark of confidence. On her shoulder hung a leather satchel, the kind nurses often carry, but hers looked almost like a fashion statement. Jamal's jaw tightened, his brows raising. He blinked at her in disbelief. "Dad, you called the wrong number. This is a model, not a nurse." Vanessa arched a single eyebrow, her mouth curling into a half-smile that suggested she'd heard the line before. "Name's Vanessa Cole. Licensed nurse practitioner, 5 years of emergency room trauma care, now private practice. And no, I don't do modeling, unless you count modeling patients." Her voice was low, husky, with a cadence that carried both humor and authority. Raymond, unbothered by his son's shock, stepped aside. "He's upstairs, second room on the left. I'll leave you two to it." He glanced at Jamal with a look that meant, "Don't start something you can't finish." Vanessa followed Jamal up the stairs, her heels clicking on the wood, her red dress swaying like a flag Jamal couldn't ignore. Inside his room, Jamal felt a sudden claustrophobia. His walls were lined with sketches of furniture designs, cutouts from magazines, and a blueprint of the Riverlight logo he'd been dreaming about. Vanessa scanned the space with a quick but perceptive glance, the corners of her lips twitching as if she was cataloging the man behind the mess. "All right," she said, setting her satchel on the desk. "Show me the arm." "It's broken, not complicated," Jamal muttered. She turned to him, her expression sharpening. "You want to heal right? Or do you want to spend the next 20 years talking about how you used to be a woodworker until you couldn't hold a hammer?" Jamal opened his mouth, then closed it. Without another word, he extended his arm. Vanessa worked with surprising efficiency. She checked circulation, adjusted the sling, and replaced the wrap with one of her own tighter, neater, more comfortable. Her hands were steady, warm against his skin. She smelled faintly of cinnamon and cedarwood, a contrast to the sterile tang he associated with hospitals. "You're good at this," Jamal admitted reluctantly. "Thank you for finally noticing," she quipped, but there was no arrogance in her tone, just the practiced edge of a woman used to proving herself over and over. As she worked, Jamal's curiosity tugged at him. "Why the dress?" Vanessa glanced at him, her lips twitching. "Because scrubs make people treat you like wallpaper. I wear red so they remember I'm here. Patients don't forget me, and neither do their families." Her voice softened. "And because once, a supervisor told me I looked unprofessional, too distracting. I decided to lean into it instead of apologizing." Jamal studied her then, realizing her choice wasn't vanity, but defiance. Downstairs, Raymond's voice carried faintly through the house, barking at someone on the phone. Ginger padded into the room and leapt onto Jamal's bed, curling at his side as if supervising Vanessa's work. Vanessa gave the cat a quick scratch between the ears. "Inspector General, huh?" "Her name's Ginger. She thinks she runs the place," Jamal said. The session finished quickly, and Vanessa packed her tools. She looked at Jamal with a measured gaze. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't heal bones. Follow my instructions, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get back to your workshop before summer." Jamal smirked, though his eyes betrayed genuine relief. "Guess I misjudged you." "That's a habit you might want to break along with the arm," she said, slinging her satchel over her shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow." As she left the room, the red of her dress caught the afternoon light filtering through the rain-streaked window. Jamal sat back against his pillows, unsettled. The nurse in the red dress was nothing like he expected, neither fragile nor frivolous. She was sharp, skilled, and unapologetic. For the first time since the accident, something sparked inside him that wasn't fear or frustration. It was curiosity, dangerous, insistent curiosity about the woman in red. The third morning after the accident, Riverside's air still smelled faintly of damp lumber. The scent carried on from a week of gray skies. The storm had passed, but the clouds left behind a humidity that clung to the clapboards of every house like an unwanted coat. In the Rivers household, the windows were open to let in the coolness of dawn, but Jamal Rivers felt nothing cool in his chest. His right arm hung useless in its sling, the cast itching like an unwanted reminder of failure. He sat in the living room, restless, shifting in his chair as though motion might trick his body into feeling useful again. Ginger, the shop cat, perched on the windowsill, tail twitching in disapproval at his mood. The front door opened with the crisp click of a heel. Vanessa Cole, dressed once again in her trademark red, this time a sleeveless dress that brushed just above her knees, entered with the calm confidence of someone who owned every space she stepped into. Her hair, loose waves that framed her sharp cheekbones, glistened faintly from the morning dew. She carried her satchel slung over one shoulder, her other hand holding a thermos that smelled of cinnamon and coffee. She moved with grace, but also precision, the kind of balance learned by women who have been forced to walk through rooms filled with doubt and judgment and refuse to bend. Jamal's eyes flicked toward her and then away. "You're late," he muttered, though she was not. Vanessa arched an eyebrow, unbothered. "I'm on time." "You're just impatient." She set her thermos on the side table and unzipped her satchel. "Let me see the arm." Jamal stood reluctantly, his hazel eyes hard. "Feels like a leash," he said, lifting the cast into the air. "Every time I try to do something, it's there. A reminder that I'm useless." "Not useless," Vanessa corrected, checking the sling. Her hands were gentle but firm. "Healing." "Same thing," Jamal shot back, his voice sharper than intended. Vanessa looked at him steadily, her green eyes catching the morning light like shards of glass. "There it is," she said softly. "The fear. You think this broken arm means you're broken, that if you can't build, you're nothing." Jamal stiffened, caught between anger and shame. "You don't know me." Her lips curved into a wry smile. "I know enough. I've seen this before. Men and women whose worth is tied so tightly to what they produce, they collapse when life forces them to stop. You're not the first, Jamal. The silence stretched, filled only by Ginger's soft meow as she leapt down from the windowsill to wind around Vanessa's legs. Vanessa bent to scratch the cat behind the ears, her red dress shifting like a flare of fire in the gray room. Jamal watched, jaw tight, conflicted. Finally, Vanessa straightened, her expression softening. "Do you want to know why I wear red?" Jamal frowned, defensive. "Because you like the attention?" "Because once," Vanessa said, voice lowering, "a supervisor told me I looked unprofessional. Said my body was a distraction. Said patients wouldn't take me seriously unless I blended in. Scrubs in gray and blue, hair pulled tight, no lipstick, no earrings, like I was wallpaper." She glanced down at her dress, smoothed the fabric with a deliberate motion. "So I chose red. Every day. It says, I'm here, I'm competent, and I don't apologize for existing." Her words hit the room like sparks on dry wood. Jamal blinked, his irritation faltering. He had expected arrogance. Instead, he found defiance. "I know what it feels like," she continued, "to be dismissed before you even prove yourself. To have people assume you're less because you don't fit their mold. And I know what it's like to fight back by being louder, brighter, harder to ignore." Jamal sat back heavily, his cast clattering against the arm of the chair. "So you fight by being red." "I fight by being myself," Vanessa corrected. For a moment, the room softened. Jamal studied her face, noting the faint shadow beneath her eyes, the hint of weariness behind her confidence. She wasn't untouchable. She was someone who had been bruised by judgment but refused to live in gray. He felt something shift inside him. Not admiration exactly, but recognition. But pride still bristled. "Doesn't change the fact I'm stuck here," Jamal said, looking down at his useless hand. "Can't work, can't build, can't prove anything." Vanessa placed her satchel on the table and leaned closer, her voice firm but not unkind. "Then maybe this is the time you learn who you are when you're not proving something." Jamal wanted to argue, but her gaze pinned him. He felt as though she could see through every excuse, every brittle defense he'd built. The silence stretched again, thick but no longer hostile. Raymond's voice carried from the kitchen, where he was on the phone with a client. His words were muffled but sharp, the tone of a man making apologies he hated making. Jamal winced. Each muffled syllable felt like another reminder that he was costing the family business. Vanessa noticed his shoulders stiffen. She set a hand gently on his good arm. "Healing isn't weakness, Jamal. It's survival. The only question is whether you'll come out bitter or stronger." Jamal met her eyes again, and for the first time his gaze softened. "You're stubborn," he said. Vanessa smiled. "Takes one to know one." They shared a quiet laugh, brief but genuine. Ginger, curled at Vanessa's feet, purred as if sealing the truce. By the time Vanessa packed her satchel and prepared to leave, the tension in the room had eased. Jamal still felt caged, still hated the sling and cast, but a flicker of something new had taken root beneath the frustration. Curiosity, not just about Vanessa, but about himself. As she reached the door, Vanessa turned back. "I'll see you tomorrow." "And Jamal?" "What?" "Try not to confuse healing with failure. They're not the same." When the door shut behind her, Jamal sat in silence, the echo of her words lingering. For the first time since the accident, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. The evening settled over Riverside like a thick blanket, damp and heavy from another day of unsettled skies. By late October, the town's rhythm had already shifted toward early darkness, porches glowing before supper, and the distant hum of furnaces flicking on for the first time of the season. Inside the Rivers household, a storm rolled across the hills and brought with it a sudden blackout. The ceiling fan stuttered to silence, the hum of the refrigerator died, and the only sound left was the nervous tick of Ginger's paws as the cat paced across the hardwood. Jamal Rivers sat at the kitchen table, his right arm still bound in its cast, his sling digging against his shoulder. He had pulled out a small project he'd been nursing before the accident, a jewelry box intended for a local teacher who had ordered it as a Christmas gift. The unfinished box sat before him, the grain of cherry wood glowing faintly even in the fading light. Jamal fumbled with the lid, trying to fit it with one hand, but his movements were clumsy. The pieces clattered against the table, his left hand unable to keep them steady. His frustration rose like a tide, the silence of the powerless house only amplifying it. Into that quiet entered Vanessa Cole, her red dress muted in the dim glow of the storm but still striking, as though it absorbed what little light remained. She carried 2 tall candles in brass holders and set them on the table, the flames spilling amber warmth across her face. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling to brush her cheeks. She had exchanged her heels for slippers she found near the door, and from her satchel she pulled a folded apron that looked comically out of place against her dress. Yet she slipped it over her head with ease, tying the knot behind her waist. "You're going to drive yourself insane if you keep forcing it," she said, watching him struggle with the box. "I have to finish it," Jamal muttered, jaw tight. "Promised it'd be done by the end of the month. And I'm already behind." Vanessa stepped closer, the apron brushing against her dress, the red fabric catching in the candlelight like a flicker of flame. She reached for the box, her hand steady and sure. "Then let me help." Jamal looked up sharply. "You don't know woodworking." "I know enough about patience and detail," she countered, sliding into the chair across from him. "Besides, nursing is precision, 2 different tools, same principle." Reluctantly, Jamal pushed the project toward her. She examined the lid, tracing the grain with her fingertip as though reading a language she'd never studied but already understood. She set the lid gently into place, then nodded toward the chisel resting on the table. "You hold it. I'll guide." Together, they worked. Jamal's left hand gripped the box steady while Vanessa guided the chisel with careful pressure. Her movements were slower than his, but exact, the candlelight illuminating the concentration etched across her face. Jamal watched her, noting how her emerald green eyes narrowed in focus, how the corners of her lips pursed when she measured the angle, how the apron couldn't hide the confident poise with which she carried herself. The storm outside rattled the windows, thunder low and insistent, but the cabin-like kitchen glowed with intimacy. Ginger hopped onto the counter, curling into a loaf shape, her tail twitching as she kept watch. Raymond was nowhere to be seen, having gone to bed early with a lantern and the grumbling words of a man who trusted storms less than silence. The house felt, for once, like it belonged to Jamal and Vanessa alone. As they worked, Vanessa broke the silence. "You know," she said softly, "when I was a girl, my grandmother taught me how to quilt. She said it wasn't about making something perfect. It was about stitching stories together. I think wood is like that. Every piece has scars, knots, colors. It's not perfect, but it tells a story if you listen." Jamal's gaze lingered on her. "Never thought I'd hear a nurse compare woodworking to quilting. Never thought you'd see a nurse in a red dress chiseling a jewelry box either," she replied with a grin. He chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. For days his laughter had felt buried under the weight of injury and doubt. Now, in the glow of the candles, with Vanessa's confidence steadying him, the heaviness began to ease. The lid finally fit snug into place. Vanessa leaned back, brushing sawdust from her hands. "There. Not perfect, but it's whole." Jamal stared at the finished piece, his heart beating faster than the moment warranted. He hadn't expected her help to matter this much. "Thank you," he said, the words rough but sincere. Her expression softened, the candlelight catching the warmth in her green eyes. "You don't have to do everything alone, Jamal. Sometimes strength is letting someone stand beside you." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the flicker of the candles casting shadows that danced across the walls. Jamal noticed how the flame seemed to paint her dress alive, each movement making the fabric shimmer. His chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with something unfamiliar, something fragile and dangerous. He shifted, his good hand brushing lightly against hers as he reached for the box. The touch was brief, accidental perhaps, but it sent a charge through him. Vanessa didn't pull away. Instead, she let the silence linger, her lips curving just slightly into a knowing smile. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, the world had narrowed to the soft crackle of the stove's embers, the glow of candlelight, and the unspoken promise of something new. Jamal felt his heart stir in a way it hadn't in weeks. His broken arm still ached, but for the first time since the accident, he felt something healing deeper than bone. Riverside's gossip traveled faster than the trains that sliced past the edge of town, and in small communities where everyone knew the names of children, pets, and even the brands of tools men carried, bad news moved like wildfire. By the end of the week, whispers about Jamal Rivers' broken arm had seeped into every diner booth and bar stool. Some shook their heads in sympathy, but others smirked, muttering that dreams of a young man's shop called Riverlight had ended before the sign was ever carved. At the heart of those whispers stood Mason Hale, a rival woodworker whose smile was as sharp as the nails he bent into his projects. Mason was in his mid-30s, tall with the bulk of a man who lifted lumber not as craft but as spectacle. His beard was a thick copper mess that caught crumbs of biscuits and smoke from the cigars he chewed rather than smoked. His eyes, pale gray, always seemed to carry the sheen of calculation, as if every conversation were a hand of cards. Mason had carved out a niche in Riverside by being loud, fast, and cheap, three qualities that won customers quicker than Jamal's quiet precision. To the town, Mason was the man who delivered good enough on time, and he despised that Jamal's work, though fewer in number, carried the reverence of art. When Jamal's accident reached his ears, Mason smiled wide at the chance to snuff out competition. He told customers at his shop, Hale's Carpentry, that Jamal would never recover full strength, that broken bones meant shaky hands, and shaky hands meant dangerous tables. He added fuel by suggesting Jamal's pending commissions would never be finished. Soon, one of Jamal's clients canceled outright, leaving a voicemail filled with half-hearted apologies and the phrase, "Mason says you need rest." The blow hit Jamal harder than any fracture. Sitting at his father's workbench, his left hand flipping through sketches, he felt a bitter heat spread through his chest. The jewelry box Vanessa had helped him complete glimmered on the shelf, but instead of pride, all he felt was the suffocating weight of rumor strangling his reputation. Vanessa noticed his clenched jaw and tight shoulders when she arrived that evening. She wore another red dress, this one sleeved, with a neckline modest enough for work, but bold enough to draw every eye. She carried a brown grocery bag filled with bread, soup cans, and fresh apples. "Your father told me you skipped lunch again," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "I'm not hungry," Jamal's voice was clipped. "You look like a man chewing anger instead of food," she countered, pulling out a loaf. "What happened?" Jamal slammed his notebook shut, his hazel eyes dark. "Mason, he's telling everyone I won't heal, that I'll never finish my projects. I lost a client today, just like that. Months of trust, gone because his mouth runs faster than mine." Vanessa's gaze sharpened, but her voice stayed even. "And you believe him?" "I don't know what I believe," Jamal admitted, standing abruptly. His sling swayed against his chest. "But I know I can't sit here while he ruins me." Moments later, Jamal stormed into the shop out back. The evening light had turned gold through the windows, glinting off sawdust that drifted like sparks. He marched toward a half-finished project, a farmhouse table meant for a family on the west side of town. The legs leaned against the wall, sanded but not yet joined. The top, a wide plank of oak, rested on sawhorses. Jamal grabbed it with his good hand, grunting as his cast clattered awkwardly against the wood. "Jamal, stop," Vanessa said, following him in, apron still in hand from the kitchen. "You'll hurt yourself." "I need to show I can finish something," he growled. "If I don't, Mason wins. He'll own this town." Before she could respond, the shop door swung open. Mason himself stepped inside, uninvited, his grin wide. He wore a denim jacket stained with varnish, his boots scuffed from years of careless use. "Well, look who's playing carpenter with one arm," he drawled. "Didn't think you'd still be at it, Rivers. Thought you'd hand over your clients to someone who can keep both hands on the saw." Jamal's fury flared. He dropped the plank, wood echoing across the shop floor. "Get out, Mason." "Relax," Mason said, stepping closer, voice syrupy with mockery. "I'm just looking out for your safety. Folks wouldn't want you collapsing mid-project. I'm offering them reliability. You can't blame me for that. Jamal lunged forward, despite Vanessa's sharp cry. His left hand shoved Mason's chest, but with his weakened stance he stumbled, his shoulder striking the bench. Pain shot down his casted arm. Mason chuckled cruelly. See? You can't even stand without falling. Admit it, Rivers, you're finished. The words stung deeper than the fall. Jamal sat on the floor, chest heaving, his dreams teetering on the edge of collapse. The shop smelled suddenly bitter, the scent of oak and oil tainted by humiliation. Then Vanessa knelt beside him, her red dress sweeping sawdust as she wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Her voice cut through the haze, firm but tender. "Don't you dare let this break define you," she whispered fiercely. "Don't let a broken bone turn into a broken spirit. He wants you to believe you're done. But I've seen your fire, Jamal. It's stronger than his words." Her emerald eyes burned with conviction, and Jamal felt the tight coil in his chest loosen. Mason's smirk faltered when Jamal straightened slowly, Vanessa's arm steadying him. Jamal's gaze locked with his rival's. "I'm not finished," he said, voice steady now. "Not with my work, not with my dream. You can spread rumors all you want, Mason, but when these bones heal, you'll see who's left standing." For the first time, Mason's grin slipped into a sneer. He spat onto the sawdust, muttered something about fools and wasted effort, and stalked out, the door slamming behind him. Jamal exhaled, exhaustion settling into his bones. Vanessa squeezed his shoulder. "That's better," she murmured. "You faced him. You didn't let him win." Jamal nodded, the ache in his arm pulsing but no longer unbearable. With Vanessa's words echoing in his ears, he realized the fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The autumn sun rose over Riverside with a gentleness that surprised everyone, warm light spilling across the courthouse lawn where the annual fall fair was already buzzing to life. Colorful tents lined the streets, children clutched caramel apples, and the air carried the mingled aromas of kettle corn, fried dough, and cider. For the town, the fair was more than tradition. It was where reputations were cemented, deals made, and gossip woven into the fabric of small-town life. For Jamal Rivers, this fair would be the first public chance to prove himself since the accident. His right arm was still in its cast, though the sling was gone, and the ache in his bones reminded him that healing was not complete. Yet the table he had worked on with left-handed grit and late-night persistence stood proudly at his booth. A farmhouse-style dining table of oak, sanded smooth until the grain shimmered like water. Jamal looked nervous as he adjusted a placard that read Riverlight Custom Woodworks. The name, once a whisper in his notebook, was now written in bold strokes across the banner. His hazel eyes flicked over the gathering crowd, catching familiar faces. Neighbors, old classmates, even a few customers who had hesitated after Mason's rumors. Their expressions carried curiosity, but also skepticism. Standing beside him was Vanessa Cole, radiant in yet another red dress, this one flowing with a wrap-style waist and sleeves that danced in the wind. The choice was deliberate. She had promised him that red was not just defiance, but celebration. Her dark hair was tied back, a silver pendant resting at her throat, and her green eyes sparkled with something more than confidence, pride. She moved with the ease of someone who belonged, handing out flyers Jamal had printed and answering questions with quick wit. From across the fairground, Mason Hale appeared, his bulk cutting a path through the crowd. He wore a plaid shirt rolled to the elbows and boots scuffed with deliberate neglect, his copper beard framing a grin wide enough to split his face. But there was unease in the way his eyes darted. Rumors had started to turn against him. Whispers of him sabotaging competitors, shortchanging clients, and spreading lies. A few men who had once laughed with him now nodded only curtly. As the morning stretched, more townsfolk gathered at Jamal's booth. Mrs. Monahan, a grandmotherly woman with white curls and a voice like honey, ran her hand across the oak table. "My lord, this feels like it'll outlast me and my grandchildren, too." "Beautiful work, Jamal." Her words carried weight. She was known to influence half the town's church committee. Coach Delaney, broad-shouldered with a booming laugh, stopped by next, slapping Jamal's back gently. Thought you were down for the count, son. Guess you proved us wrong. Each compliment chipped away at Jamal's anxiety until he stood taller, pride straightening his shoulders. Vanessa noticed and smiled quietly to herself. Mason, unable to contain himself, finally stepped forward. "Nice table," he sneered loud enough for nearby ears. "Shame it's probably the last one you'll make before that arm quits on you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jamal stiffened, but before he could respond, Sarah Whitfield, a tall woman in her late 40s with sharp cheekbones and eyes tired from years of managing the town's feed store, spoke up. "That's rich. Coming from you, Mason. Didn't you leave the Cooper family waiting 6 months for a staircase you promised?" Sarah's voice was steady but edged with old frustration. Her family had nearly lost business over Mason's shortcuts years ago, and she had never forgiven him. Others began to murmur, recalling delays, broken promises, and Mason's crude jokes. His grin faltered. Jamal seized the moment. He placed his good hand on the table, his cast visible but not hidden. "I may be healing, but I finished this table. I will finish others. Riverlight isn't about speed or shortcuts. It's about building something worth keeping. If you want cheap, you know where to go. But if you want honest work, I'll be here." The crowd broke into applause. Mason muttered under his breath and stalked away, shoulders stiff. The whispers now were no longer about Jamal's broken arm, but about Mason's broken reputation. In the midst of it all, Raymond Rivers appeared, his weathered face unreadable at first. He wore his work jacket, his gray hair combed back, eyes scanning the booth as if inspecting a ship before setting sail. Jamal braced himself for criticism. Instead, Raymond stepped forward, ran his rough hand across the oak, and nodded once. "Solid work," he said simply. Then, for the first time in years, his lips tugged into a smile, small, restrained, but unmistakably proud. Jamal's chest tightened with relief, a weight lifting he hadn't realized he carried. As the day wound down, lanterns were lit across the fairgrounds. Music drifted from the stage where teenagers strummed guitars and families lingered with paper plates of fried chicken and pies. Jamal packed away his flyers, but the table remained, sold already to a local family who promised to show it off at every holiday. Vanessa lingered at his side, her dress glowing in the lantern light. Jamal turned to her, words tumbling up before he could stop them. His voice, low but steady, carried all the emotion he had kept locked inside. "You came into my life in a red dress," he said, hazel eyes fixed on her. "But what you left behind wasn't just color, it was hope. I didn't know I needed it until you gave it." For once, Vanessa's confidence softened. Her eyes glistened, and she reached out, brushing his hand lightly. "You finally said it," she whispered. Their moment lingered, quiet and unhurried, even as laughter and music filled the fair. The promise between them wasn't just words. It was a vow, unspoken but real, that neither broken bones nor broken rumors could take away. Weeks later, the sign for Riverlight Custom Woodworks hung above a refurbished corner shop on Maple Street. The windows gleamed, the floor smelled of fresh varnish, and the first customers stepped inside with smiles. Jamal stood at the counter, cast finally removed, his hands still stiff but strong enough to guide tools again. At his side stood Vanessa, still in red, but now with her presence woven into the very fabric of his dream. Together, they had built something more enduring than oak or nails partnership, resilience, and love. In the end, Jamal's story reminds us that broken bones can heal, but what truly matters is refusing to let the spirit break. We all face setbacks, whether it is in our work, our health, or our relationships. But each challenge can become the spark that shapes us into something stronger. Hope often arrives when we least expect it, sometimes dressed in red, sometimes in the quiet encouragement of those who believe in us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need encouragement today. Leave a comment below and let us know what part spoke to you the most. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you can join us for more stories of resilience, love, and faith. May God bless everyone who watched to the end. If you believe in second chances and in hope rising after hardship, write Amen in the comments.